Good morning, everybody. My name is Fiona McAlinden, and I'll be introducing Reece to the event today. People are still joining us as I speak, but thank you for everybody who's here already. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands, of the different lands of which we're joining from today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So welcome everybody to our event this morning. Impacts of Occupational Deprivation, Reducing the Trauma by Reece Adams, who's our Director of Occupational Therapy at Hearth Allied Health. My name is Fiona McAlinden. I'm the General Manager of Hearth Allied Health. And for those of you who are not familiar with Hearth, we commenced in 2020, and we offer services of occupational therapy, speech pathology, and positive behaviour support. And we work alongside Hearth Support Services, who've been going a bit longer. They've been operating for almost 6 years now. Hearth Allied Health is a growing team. I would encourage you to check out our website for resources and for any career opportunities as well. We plan to offer an ongoing series of professional development events in 2023. We've done several this year as well. And our next event will be a PBS event, probably late February or early March, and we'll send anybody invites. If you're on this session today, it means that you're on our list for receiving professional development information. So Reece's session will be recorded today, and you'll receive a copy of the slides after the event, a recording of the event, and a certificate of attendance for professional development. So let me just tell you a little bit about Reece. Reece and I both came from Monash Health previously. So Reece is our Director of Occupational Therapy, Research and Innovation. He's very talented. Reece has almost 20 years experience working in the disability sector, and he began his career as a disability support worker, and he has continued working with people with disabilities in various capacities, including as an occupational therapist, a researcher, and head of statewide service for people with an intellectual and developmental disabilities. His experience includes community-based services for people with disabilities such as vision impairment, neurological conditions, and complex developmental disabilities. In 2016, Reece began leading research for the statewide Centre for Developmental Disability Health and was head of the centre from 2019 to 2022. So Reece's passion for collaborating with people with disabilities has led to the development of much needed services and resources, including the Specialist Healthcare Access Support Model and the recently launched My Lived ID Hub. The My Lived ID Hub supports Australians with intellectual disabilities and mental health needs, access information, education, and find services local to them across Australia. A very important initiative. What drives Reece is his aim to improve the quality of lives for people with disabilities, which prompted his idea to share his knowledge on today's important topic. So without much ado, I'll hand you over to Reece. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Fiona, for introducing me. That was very polite. For all those that don't know me, I am Reece Adams, and as Fiona said, I'm the Director of Occupational Therapy and Research Innovation here at Hearth Allied Health. Before I do begin, I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the different lands in which we're joining from today and pay my respects to elders of past and present. But I also acknowledge the almost 40% of the First Nations population and community who live with a disability, and I share my support to them as well. So without further ado, I'll start our presentation today. So today is quite a timely presentation. The reason for this is because it's often around this time of year where we often see that some people with more complex disabilities experience trauma through the holiday period. And so today I thought we would unpack a bit about why that occurs and why it's important for us to look at how we can support people with complex needs, both during this period, but also during different parts of their life as well. So not everything is just around, school holidays or whether it be day program holidays, but more broadly speaking, when the person loses their occupations of regular participation, it can actually have significant detriments for the individual. So today I'm going to cover, and I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, are occupational therapists. So apologies that you'll probably get a brief introduction to something you're already familiar with. But also, I wanted to introduce it because there might be some people who are not occupational therapists and may have heard about today's session and wanted to participate. We're going to talk briefly about occupational deprivation and the trauma that can occur because of it. And we're also going to have a case example. And then lastly, we're going to follow up with some strategies to look at promoting the engagement and how we can support people during periods of where they've lost occupation, and what strategies could be used and resources that could be used moving forward. So I'll start with a very basic definition of occupational therapy. This is something that I actually developed in my third year as an OT student. And it's something that I've continued to use today when trying to just simply describe what we do as occupational therapy, as occupational therapists, I should say. Everything we do is an occupation. It's the activities that occupy our time. And we all know that that's the broad stretch of whether it be our personal care tasks to our leisure tasks, to our tasks of employment or school, but even things like sleeping and other real essential tasks that we participate in on a daily basis are all things that occupy our time. And therefore, what we do as occupational therapists is we look at how we can support a person to achieve those activities at the best of their abilities. And so when I strip it right back to the beginning, and this is a model that I grew up as a young OT with, was the person, environment, and occupation model. And it's one that resonated a lot for me, and something that I guess carries through today's presentation as I continue to present about occupational deprivation. And this one came from Mary Law and her colleagues in Canada. And it's a very old reference to us now, but when I was studying, it was a relatively newer reference at the time. And so when we look at the person, environment, occupation, where this model started was actually looking at the older models where it was around the person, environment relationship. And so when we talk about the person, it's the attributes or the unique things of the individual that they bring to interact with the environment that they participate in their activities in. And then obviously from the environmental perspective, we're looking at the context of which the individual will perform their activities in. And so that intersection then is what's the occupations that need to be completed in their environment and by the person. And I guess that's where we start to see what is the occupational performance of the individual. And so I think as a sort of summary, a very high level, more broader sort of concept, this is a really nice model that we start to bring into thinking about how we look at an individual, and we take our approaches to actually starting to assess and to unpack how we can better support the individual moving forward to participate in occupations. So when we look at occupational deprivation is the experience of being prevented or having the inability to participate and engage in activities of choice or necessity. So because of occupational deprivation, a person can experience detriment to their physical health, their mental health, their relationships, and their quality of life. And so when we think about certain groups or people that may be impacted by occupational deprivation, we might start to think more about certain particular groups, say, for example, the group of people with autism, or people with more complex and significant mental health conditions. But equally, we do look at the physical disability cohort as well. And so I guess when we start to unpack it for each group, there'll be different aspects that we'll have to look at as to why the individual may be experiencing deprivation. But it's really important to understand that when we do look at this, we look at this quite intersectionally, and how someone may have physical disabilities, but because of their occupational deprivation, experience mental health conditions or deteriorations, and then also what that means for the individual and their relationships and quality of life. So it's very much that intersectional view and approach to this. And so then let's talk about the trauma. So how does a loss of an occupation affect a person? Now, these are just some examples, and it can be very meaningful to each individual differently. But we start to, when we look at it, it could be their support networks. It could be their accommodation. It could be their behavior, their NDIS plan. And we all know, and there's a particular one that I probably sit on a little bit more intensely on, is because we know that the NDIS does not have an emergency response structure. So how it impacts an individual's NDIS plan can be quite significant in how they then can access the supports that they need to help support them through that scenario or through that time they might be experiencing this. The sense of self and purpose, which is really important for every individual, again, differently. So when we might be working with people who maybe don't have, cognitive impairment, their roles may have changed. They may have acquired a disability. And so even through that process alone, there's a certain sense of self, role, purpose that we need to continue to acknowledge and look to support. That social inclusivity. Now, we know that the NDIS very much has been reared around social and economic participation, but that social inclusivity is really, really vital. We've definitely seen a shift in more recent years where how do we engage people more socially? It's not just about the person going out into the community, but we've also seen how people have changed how they, day programs have changed in their designs, but also how people access day programs have changed. Also, we're seeing a more growing need for groups, which include both a practical and obviously a therapeutic component, but also include that social connection with others. And that can really build a lot of strength in peer support. And obviously the service interactions. And I'll probably, in my case example, unpack that a bit more, which we've seen very regularly in health. And as Fiona said, I've come from working in a large tertiary health service here in Victoria. And what we experienced through there was definitely people who had deteriorations that meant hospitalization, and sometimes unnecessarily. But also on top of that is the overlay of their experience during their admissions, and then how that has impacted their futures. So I'll lead into a case example. So Joe is a 17-year-old individual, lives with their family, so their mum, their dad, their younger brother and sister. Now, Joe has a moderate intellectual disability, autism, and a neuromuscular disorder that affects their strength and balance. Joe finished school at 16 and has been attending a day program for the last 7 months. Joe started their summer holidays, and Joe's family reports they're appearing to increase in their anxieties about the holidays, and they were even appearing that prior to the holidays beginning. So when I'm reading this case, I'm sure many of you are identifying cases that you've experienced with individuals leading up to this, and even you yourselves may have experienced this. This is not unique to just people with disabilities. It is very much human behavior nature that when we start to experience things coming up that we haven't necessarily planned for or thought about, we start to feel a little bit anxious. If you have families, parents often say, I've got to find things for the kids to do on the holidays. It is a strike of anxiety when we come to these sort of times. So because of this, and during this time, Joe was unable to have regular support workers. And the reason for that is that the support workers that they had were burning out. They were unable to continue that support. Some were actually quite apprehensive to come in to support Joe, which is a real challenge when you're trying to get people on board to support this person. You're saying, well, we're here to help, but support workers become a real crux of that whole team because they are the persons there on shift for a very long period of time. So it's very much, we need to get this group on board. And so for Joe, they were unable to have a regular support workforce. They then began to demonstrate they were hitting themselves, so self-injurious behaviors, but also hitting others. And so when you see those escalations, that becomes quite terrifying. And so for the family, that was really, really distressing to see. And it was something that they weren't used to seeing as well. If I remember Joe's mum saying to me that she had not seen Joe behave like that ever before. So that was really, I guess, distressing for them. Joe stopped going out into the community for various reasons. So obviously there was the more practical, the logistical nature of Joe being able to go out into the community to do the things that we knew Joe loved. So going out to whether it be the park, but really shopping centres and being able to sit around and people watch and enjoy that experience of having a coffee and all the rest of it that comes with for Joe going to a shopping centre. And so that was a real loss. But aside from that, it's the risk as well. So aside from people being apprehensive to take Joe out into the community, not knowing what might happen, not knowing what might be triggers, but also because of the risk for if something happened, if Joe became distressed, what that meant. And so that became a real barrier for Joe. And unfortunately, in Joe's circumstance, Joe was taken to the emergency department. And for Joe, because the behaviours were so significant and escalated so quickly, Joe was required to be sedated and have a 4-point restraints used as well because of code greys that were being experienced in the emergency department. Now, this is, for some of you listening might think that this is probably really extreme and, oh, this doesn't happen to just everyone, but it does happen to people. And those are the mechanisms that are introduced in those services, but in those environments to manage people with particularly with escalating behaviors. And for people like Joe, because of Joe's autism, as well as their intellectual disability, that understanding that episodic that you might typically see with someone, say, under the influence of substances, it's episodic. But unfortunately for Joe, it was very much consistent. And the longer that these restraints were used, the more the behavior escalated. So it was really detrimental for Joe. So I guess when we talk about what's the longer term impact on Joe, we sit back and we think, well, okay, prescribed medications were used unnecessarily. Although they seem like a band-aid effect at the time, may actually have an ongoing use. And often what we do see is people are discharged with medications. And for those of you listening who have kept a track of the Royal Commission, you would have heard the experiences of people and the overuse of medications to manage behaviours. One thing that I often saw in people's notes was behavioural. They were acting behavioural. And what does that mean? And so I think that as time goes on for Joe, we hope with the use of other resources, we'll see that medication use reduce over time. But unfortunately, for some people, that becomes an ongoing part of their life. The experience with the family and the relationship with the family became really challenging. So for the parents, for Joe's parents, it was, as I said earlier, it was really hard for them to witness that. So for them, what does that mean for their relationship? What does it mean for their role as parents to not be able to manage their child's escalating behaviors? And what does that mean for future? Do they want to have, they've still got two other children in the home. So that starts to really impact those relationships. And that becomes that trauma for Joe because it's another loss. Joe found activities much less enjoyable and would likely potentially continue. But part of that becomes that sort of understanding that for Joe, missing out on doing those activities, there's a bit of a trauma associated where there's a bit of anxiety. There could be residual apprehension to participate because of the way that people responded previously. So the enjoyment of activities has reduced for Joe. And again, hopefully with other resources over time that will see change. The experience of difficulty maintaining regular support workers, that comes in various realms, both through, I guess, reputation. Often people read a person's profile that tends to stick with the person for a long time into the future. They've got a history of behaviors of concern. They've got a history of assaultive behaviors. And that really carries, and we don't want to see that become the sort of marking of an individual where support workers won't come in because of the potential risk. When we know, in fact, some people, for example, you may see people even have epilepsy written on. Not to say they won't have a seizure, but for some people, they've been medication managed for 20 years and not had a reported seizure. So it's really about understanding what that actually means and helping support workers to overcome some of that apprehension. The experience and anxiety of going to the GP and hospital, unfortunately for Joe, because of that experience of what happened in the hospital, particularly with the 4-point restraints, that's really concerning. And, as Fiona said, I worked at a statewide health service and patients came through all the time experiencing different effects of the treatments they received in our tertiary health system, particularly when restraints are involved. But on top of that, there's many identifiers that they see as common. So stethoscopes around the person's neck, that person made me feel woozy, so they were sedated, or they applied a restraint, or they did something that I didn't like. So something that starts to transcend into the GP's realm. There's many identifiers that they say, oh, that means something bad. So that's why environments are really, really important, because we start to see the associations and what can trigger an individual through association. So out of all of that, we come to many hands make light work. And I do say that wholeheartedly. When I talked earlier about the PEO model and I talked about some of those effects on an individual through which could become trauma, we really need to look at that intersection. And through intersection, we start to look at both interdisciplinary approaches, but we also look at transdisciplinary approaches. And so it's really that transdisciplinary and that interdisciplinary that are really, really important, particularly in the NDIS space, where we're looking at how do we work together to support an individual. But before we begin, there's some certain elements that I want us to talk about first, before we start to really unpack the strategies moving forward. Communication. I'm sure many of you have heard or say this yourself, communication is key. It is the things of what we do as relationships generally. We look at how we communicate on a regular basis. It's really, really important, and it's what helps us have successful engagement. So it really is important if we think about how we tell a person. So for example, in Joe's circumstance, in Joe's case, he got, sorry, not he, they, because that's their pronoun, they experienced a lot of anxiety leading up to the holidays. Now, what if we thought about how we tell Joe moving forward what is coming? So communication becomes really, really important in these circumstances. When we tell them also becomes really important. Everyone is everyone is different. Everyone is an individual. Some people may sit and stew on it. If you know that you've got a person that's really, really anxious when being told information, then needs that ongoing reassurance to reduce the anxiety, again, thinking about when's the time to tell a person about either impending events in their lives, or any impending changes that the person might be experiencing. And that goes in many different realms. So it's not just about the activity or the holiday time or the change in sort of, I guess, the calendar, but also it could be the change in the people. So the change of the person that's coming to support Joe, for example. How we tell the person also is really, really important. So when we start to think about, social stories, now social stories are very common, but they're very successful. So we can use social stories if an individual responds well to social stories. They may never have had a social story, so it doesn't hurt to try. But working with a person, working with the speech pathologist, for example, who may know the person's communication really, really well. If they don't have a speech pathologist, maybe even consider that for a future planning. But in the meantime, you still can do things to help support the person around their communication needs. Consistent, direct, and clear communication is the absolute essential to how we support people to manage some of these things. We also, when they're experiencing some of these events and times, sometimes it's literally down to the communication that helps de-escalate that behavior. So it's really important that we think about, we know and learn about how we communicate best with an individual. Choice. Choice it's an important right to all of us. We all use choice on a regular basis. Choice provides an opportunity to explore different options, but choice can also be really overwhelming. So when we talk about the overwhelming factor, again, even if we reflect on ourselves, we're all very different people in how we like choices. So for example, I know myself, I like very limited choices. And it's only because sometimes, because of my life, because of my work and my personal life, I get decision fatigue just like everyone else does. So choice for me in many aspects has to be simplified, or else I don't know. I have to unpack, I have to explore. The same goes with people who might find it really overwhelming to have too many choices available, because the thing that they might be thinking about is, how will I respond to that choice? So the choice might be really positive, and all choices might be positive, but what if this choice is really, really positive for me? But actually, I also liked this one. I had a really good experience going to this park, so maybe I could go here. Or, oh, I could also go to this shopping center. I love the shopping center. So when we think about choice, we have to think about not overwhelming the individual and bring it back. It's very much old school behavior management. Choice sometimes needs to be simplified. So when we talk about simplifying the choice, it may not be as large as things like, parks and things that are, multiple stimuli, multiple facets to this environment that you're potentially going to choose to take, or even the activity, the multiple facets that come from that activity. So it could be the people that are involved in that activity, such as a social outing, versus a solo activity where it's maybe a walk in the park, or again, we might be some home-based activities, so things like cooking. So really thinking about what best suits the individual in simplifying the choice, because again, we don't want to overwhelm the person with too much information that they can't see through to make that end decision. And it's really that empowerment of that individual that becomes so important, knowing the individual. If we limit their choices and we make it easier around the communication, that concentration and making the decision hopefully will be much easier for the individual. And again, going back to my previous slide, thinking about how we communicate that choice, again, with visuals, or whether we do it with verbal or using their particular communication aid or device is really, really important how we approach that. So the resources. So the resources themselves, they can include a varying flurry of options. So I guess when we talk about, choice and we talk about people making decisions, family become a really great resource. They know the person really well. They know the person's likes, dislikes, often quite intrinsically. Obviously, what I really always advocate before I continue reading through this list is that you do really try and empower the person first and foremost to participate in designing even what those choices could be. Support staff as well know the person really well often. Sometimes they don't, but they might know enough of a history to be able to support that decision making and that development of resources. Teachers and day program staff are great. The amount of times that I've worked with so many great staff from various environments, because they see the person in different context. They don't see the person necessarily at that sort of day-to-day personal care routine, that living, which support staff are more sort of focused on when we're talking about people that attend a day program 5 days a week, for example. But day programs see what are some of those things that need to be accounted for, their safety when traveling and what sort of travel has been more successful than others, how they've engaged the person to get the person motivated to go. Does the person do well in groups? Does the person do well by themselves? So all that information can come from teachers and day program staff, which is really great. Also, what resources they've used locally, also really important. You don't always have to recreate the wheel. Written tools, so communication books, charts. So really important around behavior and other charts. So, for example, if a person's going through a certain period of time, like the holiday period, maybe a sleep chart might help. So if the person is highly anxious, you might start to see that they're having a lot of disturbed sleep because of anxiety as to what's happening the next day, for example. And the recording tools that go with it, how we ensure that we record information is really important, because we as clinicians, for example, if you're a clinician, we rely on people telling us. So we often go in and we look for those resources and those tools that have recorded things, as well as just relying on the information that's verbally handed over. The supporting resources, as I said earlier, visual aids, social stories. We can look at varying supporting resources that can help us implement our choices, implement our changes, and implement our guidance on what activities we might be doing and how we're going to do those activities. So, one resource that I've enjoys creating for people is sometimes those routine boards. If any of you have created them, they're really great because it steps a person bit by bit, but also for everyone around that person, it's a communication tool about what's expected for the person for that day. And healthcare professionals, it's really important that they are part of the team, not just allied health, but also medical and nursing. If they have them involved, they're really great resources around why certain things are in place, side effects of medications, or, if a person is incontinent and, that's starting to affect how they participate in activities, leaning back on the incontinence team to work out, how it's changed and what has changed and what's the best resolution moving forward. Lean on each other. It's a real team effort. So I've got 4 easy steps for us to follow in how we start preparing a person for holiday period, or just to implement a routine around activities and so forth. So assist the person to engage means understanding the role we have in supporting the person. So whether we're there to help identify the activities or whether we can just empower and support the person with their own identifying of activities, planning the activities. So what are the steps that are required when we talk about planning? So is it travel if it's out in the community? Is it preparation of if it's in home and it's things like cooking, for example? the ingredients, doing the shopping, etc., etc. So it's really about planning. It becomes key. And where can you involve the person as well along the way is so important. And that ties down to our engaging in activities. What levels can people engage in activities? They don't have to, not everyone has to do everything, because some things can be really overwhelming. Going to the supermarket for some individuals can be too overwhelming. There's too much visual products, too many choices. Equally, they have obsessions. Some people have obsessions. We all like certain things. We all can moderate and manage it, but for some people, they go straight for the chocolate aisle. So it's really about how we engage the person in the activity and what's suitable and what's safe and how do we support that. And sometimes for some people, it's that pre-planning and preparation of wording them up before you go into the shops, for example. So planning the activity. So let's think about how we're going to communicate it. So I've already talked about you're going to unpack the steps. Going back to our previous part where we talked about communication, how are we going to communicate the activity to the person? Who will lead the communication? So if there is a support team that's helping the person to do the activity, who is leading that communication with that person for that activity? One of the hardest things from an audio perspective is that it can be really distracting if there's too many voices, too many noise, and also who am I expecting the direction from? So it's really important we have a lead. How will we positively reinforce that activity? So again, thinking about what are the likes, what are the verbal prompts that support a person and reinforce things. It's not always just about being like, good job. Classic term, sometimes it's just good enough. But sometimes we also have to think outside and just say, look, when we finish this activity, we're going to do this. And it's really engaging and it reinforces something. One, they're expecting something else to happen that they enjoy. But two, we're rewarding them as well, particularly if the activity is a mundane activity. During holiday periods, again, personal care can be a real fall apart. So maybe using positive reinforcement, say, okay, we're going to do this really great activity that you will love. But before we do that, we have to have a shower and we have to get dressed and we have to. And so it's that reinforcement along the way. And what do we do if any issues come up? So what's our resolution to things? So if a person starts to escalate a bit with some behaviors, what do we do? How do we start to de-escalate? And that's where if the person has a behavior support plan, becomes really important to introduce that into our planning. Equally, what if we get there and the centre's closed? Or what if we get there and we can't do whatever it is that we're planning to do? What's our backup option? So it's always nice to have a bit of a plan that you might need to do something else because it's too crowded or it's closed. So again, thinking about some of those sort of navigation and troubleshooting what to do. Now, when we engage the person, knowing their likes and dislikes is one of the best things that we can start off with, because we start to then not only think about that in the activities that we're starting to suggest and work on and build, but we're also looking at that reinforcement of purpose as well. The empowerment of choice is not just about engaging a person in communication, but how we empowering their choice. The reassurance that they're in control is really, really important. Whatever you want, these are your two choices, for example. Whatever you would like to do, it's your choice. It's your holidays. It's that real sort of positive empowerment. And create the positive attitude towards the environment and the activity. So think about, wow, look at how beautiful day it is. It's so nice. Oh, I love feeling the sun on my skin. It's really lovely. Obviously slip, slop, slap, in case some people are thinking that. But it's really nice to really create that really energy, because that's what people respond well to. If someone else is positive, I could be in the worst situation in the world. But if the people around me are positive, I'm definitely going to pick up that positivity. Be responsive as well. So if the person is asking questions, don't just ignore the questions. Listen to the question, respond to the question is really, really important. And again, that reinforcement. So how we're going to, whether it be at the end of the activity or during the activity, what are those positives? So, we're going to get to that picnic table, we're going to sit down, we're going to have picnic. Remember the picnic we made back at home? that's what we're going to have when we get to the picnic area. So it's really nice to kind of create that real positive spin on the things. And reflect on the success. So this is, again, something that I think sometimes people forget. If it's been successful, we often go, great, it was a success, and we move on. What made it successful? Were there times where actually maybe it wasn't so successful? So did a person seem to get escalated? Yes, you may have implemented the strategies to reduce the escalation, but what if it didn't work? Or what if, what if we didn't do that particular thing that appeared to trigger that escalation? Same as, when a person engages in an activity and goes along with it and just sort of trudges, if they're not seeming that positive, yeah, you completed the activity, but was it really successful? It might not have been. So it's really unpacking and reflecting. So it's maybe even engaging the person themselves, if they can, with that sort of, was it good? And even most people, you can actually even just ask the question, did you enjoy it? And was it good? But really, how did we communicate with the person? What did we do to actually engage the person? What positive reinforcements did we use? And what were the behaviors that we saw? And what else could we do differently to improve that experience for the next time? So again, getting that down and reflecting is not just about sitting there and talking, but also recording. As I said earlier, the recording tools are important, which is why recently I developed this for a client's care team. And this is something that, we don't see often. We see often in, supported accommodations, we might see communication books and file notes. But in a person's home, it's not very natural to have a recording system. So we created something like this to help provide communication for support workers, but equally for us to learn better as a team how we could better support this person to engage in their activities longer term. So one of the things that we try not to do, particularly when we're talking about activities, if they're really engaged in things like, their personal care, their mealtime, or if they just love watching TV, that's all great. But for some people, personal care and mealtime, they're essentials. So when we think about leisure, we shouldn't just be thinking, oh, well, it's part of their daily routine. We'll also talk about that unless it's necessary. TV as well is another area that I think that, we need to think about. And this is more from a health perspective. So while some people love watching television, and I'm not saying that it's not a good thing, it can be a really great thing. And in some cases, it's a real great positive reinforcement and an activity to end up doing. But we also then miss out on certain things like the incidental exercise that comes from going and doing other activities that are a bit more active. I guess for many of us, we would probably resonate with this statement because of COVID. When we experience those restrictions and we experience those lockdowns, that incidental activity of walking around the office or going and catching the train to work, it was some of those things that we actually got exercise out of doing that we didn't get. And same applies here. When the person is restricted, we need to think about some of those incidentals or those other aspects that help keep a person healthy and think about that general well-being. With this particular tool, again, like I discussed earlier, there were some things that that I wanted to know. I really wanted to know about their negative behavior and what strategies we use, because part of that learning was how were they using the behavior support plan so that I could work with the behavior support practitioner and making this a really positive experience for the person. And we could support the workforce to help do that. And we then looked at how we could then, each activity would have its sort of, I guess, guidance for staff to use. So in summary, the really important take homes that I want everyone to take to help reduce that trauma and experience for that person is to think about the communication, think about the planning stages, think about the engagement, and most importantly, additionally, reflecting. We're very good as occupational therapists to reflect. We were taught reflections back at uni when we did journaling. It's actually a really great use of a resource to help us reflect. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, we're opening up the chat now for you to pop any questions or comments. Thank you.
In the audience. Louise.
Louise, can you pop your question in the chat?
Yeah, no.
So
Thanks. Louise, if you want to put your question in the chat or comment, that would be great. Okay. So I'll just address Joe's question. How do we explain value of occupation to funding agencies that don't value OT? It's a really great question. I think again, if we come back to some of those principles from the NDIS, and aside from I know we say social and we say economic participation, but I guess in looking at that meaningfulness of participation and how we can potentially articulate that, I guess that's where the real advocacy starts to come in, where we talk about why it's really important for OTs to support a person in everyday activities. It's, as I said right at the start, I use a very broad definition of OT. Hopefully that will help bring understanding where we talk about, some of those aspects of maintaining a person's activity participation. If it's still a struggle, a part of that might also be that it needs another review from a different planner, if that's required. Louise, sorry, just going back up. Doing cases with a positive experience on how NDIS has responded to clinical reasoning re occupation deprivation to have funding for supports approved. Yeah, so this I definitely did a couple of years ago, because as I said, I've only returned into my role more recently. But when I was working in this space, even as recent as 2019, there was a case where it was really about we were transitioning a person from day program because it seemed to be creating a lot of behavioral responses for this individual. So we had to explain that it actually was the environment that was the problem. And so we had to look at ways of either having one-to-one support. And unfortunately, groups, even though this person, we didn't want them to be restricted to not being able to engage with other people, really challenged to find group activities. It's still a bit of a gap in the market, but we were trying very hard to advocate. And what we did is we looked at more broadly how we could support this person to do the things they did sort of through day program, but not with that environment. And so we put down what the one-to-one support would look like, what activities they would be fulfilling. And it was really good. We actually got a really good outcome where, because they lived with their family, they actually enjoyed a bit of a break from the family as well. So sometimes the family would participate as well. Sometimes they wouldn't with the support worker. And it was really good because the person didn't miss out on those activities. They actually did enjoy a day program. So that was something that we had a positive outcome with. Do you have any tips for providing evidence for the need for occupational enrichment other than outcomes reports? Yeah, this is, as a researcher, I really think that going back and doing a bit of our scope of some literature always helps. As I said, there's some really great resources. So for example, OT Australia had a position paper back in 2016 around occupational deprivation. So, some of those resources can be really, really good to put back for NDIA to understand the need. And again, it's coming back to that real, meaningfulness. Meaningfulness isn't just about what, Maria Kondo sparks joy, but it's also about, what's necessity for us to function in life and to have a healthy life. So again, going back and looking at some of that evidence will help. I definitely draw upon research where I need to. Doesn't always get understood on the other end, but it's definitely, when we say, it's evidence-based, it does help. Is there any tools, communication book that can be physically taken with a participant to a hospital situation in which to reduce any traumatic experience? I'm going to, I'm sorry, Jess, I apologize about experience on the end. There are, so there are different tools like health passports. So there's a really great NHS health passport that was developed many, many moons ago. There are many different types of resource out there from the communication of people's support needs. So, for example, and I don't think it really made its way out of the region up in Queensland, but there was a really great app that was being developed for young people with autism that they could take, and it talked about their likes, dislikes, communication needs, what to do if, depending on the situation, to support the person. Equally, we're starting, and some of my research colleagues and I are starting to have conversations, what other practical existing systemic tools could we use, my health records and those kind of things to help support the tertiary health system. I wish I had the answer wholeheartedly. Say there's a generic tool that's fantastic. I think Ireland is the only country that I know of that implemented a national health passport for people with intellectual disability, for example. But have a Google search. Many more local tertiary health services have been exploring this. I mean, Bendigo Health has been doing great work in this space. They adapted the NHS tool, I believe, several years ago to implement locally, and it's been fantastic. So I just think, see if there's something in your region, so you could even contact your tertiary health service and see if there's something that they particularly have available that they use already. If they don't, then maybe have a look at those other tools, such as the NHS tool. What are some examples of activities that have been successful for a lot of individuals you've worked with that experience occupational deprivation? It's a really great question. I wish that I could say there's a great list of activities. From my experience, and when I put on sort of, I guess, my clinical hat from a mental health perspective, I'm not a mental health OT, I just want to say very quickly, but I do know a lot about intellectual disability and mental health. One of the key things that I kind of think about is the effect of what physical activity has on reducing anxiety and how they play a part together. So if there's any sort of direction that I would actually start you to think about, if there is a person that is seeming to be quite anxious, sometimes thinking about more physical outlets is great if you can think of what can engage the person. Everyone is different in their ability to engage in different and participate in different activities. It's about adopting and understanding that and adjusting where you can adjust. But again, thinking about some of those outlets are really important. So that would probably be my always starting point, depending on the situation of the individual. If it's around, I guess, sort of that leisure perspective of what is, maybe the person's just feeling a little bit lost and the support team feels a little bit lost, or the family feels a bit lost about what sort of leisure activities could be explored. I guess that's coming back to some of that more observational components where if the person can't communicate, then thinking about, what experiences have been successful. And it's kind of, I guess, like, when we start to think about the observational understanding of sensory needs, does a person respond better to visual? Does a person respond better to tactile, auditory, etc.? And then thinking about what activities, not all activities have to be out in the community. Some activities can be done at home. And so that's where, things like, for some people, bath time can be a really great de-stressor and a great occupier of time as well. So yeah, so I guess I hope that helps, but just thinking through maybe some of those aspects for the individual. Um, oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Emily, for that comment. Thank you very much, Tal, as well. It's really great. Long-term NDIS hospital participants who have experienced occupational deprivation. Yeah, that's a really good, great question, Nadia. So I think it's really challenging to look at occupational deprivation in the hospital setting. Again, from my previous experience, you've got to think about the environment. And again, stripping it all the way back to the PEO and even before the PEO, the person environment models, that comes to play and when we discuss and unpack this. Unfortunately, for a lot of those environments, they're under-resourced in the sense of what tools in actual environments they can create to support a person's occupational participation, and then other issues around staffing, and one of the issues with staffing that's been really interesting, and I think there's still a way to go and we still need to unpack, is really around the role and function of disability support workers in the tertiary health system, where they have the skill set, they have the training, often, not always, but often, to help engage people with disabilities into activity. So it's really about then fleshing out, what options they have. And, I had a really great experience when I was working at Monash Health, actually, where because the children's was obviously associated with Monash Children's, the diversional therapist for a transitioning adolescent in the adult system, the diversional therapist came over from children's and helped with different activities that typically they did with the younger cohort. And it was really great. It was a team effort. That resource isn't available to everyone in the tertiary health systems across Victoria. I understand that. So I think, there's a long way to go from the hospital setting perspective, because even if we got NDIS funding to bring it in, there's still the barriers of those environments that need to be unpacked and resolved first, such as including bringing workforce in, taking people off the wards, where do they go, what's available, etc. But really important suggestion, because when you assess people in the hospital to say what their care needs are in the community, it's really challenging to do when they're so restricted. Oh, thank you, Fana. I really appreciate it. I think, as I said at the start of my presentation, stripping it all the way back, old school, I always lean back to my foundational knowledge as an occupational therapist, even to this very day. I think it's great. And it's all about how we then bring it all together and apply new knowledge through research and education. Any resource or assisting participants to re-engage their occupation after a traumatic hospital. Yeah. So I guess, from a resources perspective, I probably would say working in joint with the positive behaviour support team is really good for this particular scenario. So I've experienced a couple of people who have come from hospital. And actually, I remember even a case, not my personal case, but a case where an individual hadn't slept in their own bed for 2 years post a hospital admission because of restraints, and they therefore they associated bed with restraints and didn't feel safe. So even just those real basic sort of occupations were being affected. I really think it's working together with positive behaviour support in some of those circumstances where the trauma has been experienced. How can we look at both the behaviour management strategies, but also overlay that with the activity itself to engage? So what are again, coming back to some of that positive reinforcements, what are those engaging factors that are going to bring a person in? That would probably be my first stop. Is there any other sort of like standardized resources? Not really. That you could just actually just take off the shelf, fill it out, and off you go. I think it's a team effort, and it's developing a plan individual to that person because their traumas will be different. So, for example, one of the things that I lean a lot onto is my colleagues in the field, and it's not unusual for me to call a colleague and say, "Hey, question," and I'm very lucky enough in my role and realm to lean on colleagues like Erin Leaf at Monash University, who does a lot of work with us around positive behaviour sport. And in fact, we had dinner last week and we were talking about the participation of people in identifying their positive reinforcements, and we had a really rich conversation about it and how we empower and proactively support people. So there are many resources available out in the sector. It's about just, I guess, developing that network and that relationship and leaning on each other. I'm looking at the time. If there's no other questions, please feel free to reach out to me. My email's on the Hearth Allied Health website, I think. Otherwise, you can contact our general email if you want to reach out to me. That's absolutely fine. As always, thank you so much. We at Hearth here are constantly a growing entity, so we really enjoy meeting new therapists along the way, and I've really enjoyed the opportunity to work with and meet new therapists along the way. So yeah, please feel free to reach out, network. We're always here to help. Thanks so much. Have a great day.